What if a deportation policy could move forward even after a federal judge says it may be unlawful? What if military action continues in Iran as a new leader gains control over a nuclear program? And what if the rules that govern the internet are being challenged in both courtrooms and in Congress? These aren't hypothetical questions. They are real legal battles happening right now in courts and government across the country. That's what we are breaking down today on Wall on Law. Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Wall on Law. My name is Jonas Wall, and I am a sophomore at the University of Delaware studying political science, criminal justice, and sociology. I created this podcast because there are major legal updates every week that affect our lives, and as a student, I didn't always understand what those changes meant for me. Wall on Law breaks down how the law actually shows up in everyday life, especially for students, young people, and non-lawyers. In today's episode, we are covering 3 major legal updates. First, we will look at a federal appeals court decision allowing third country deportations to continue while the case is still being litigated. Then, we'll discuss the escalating conflict with Iran and its new supreme leader. And finally, we'll cover the growing debate over Section 230, including a major Senate hearing and its connection to the ongoing social media addiction trial involving Meta and Google. First, let's cover a big update to a case we discussed back in episode 5 regarding migrant deportations. To quickly recap, on February 25th, a federal judge blocked a Trump administration policy that allowed migrants to be rapidly deported to third countries. Third countries are places that are not a migrant's country of origin. The court found that this went against federal immigration law and due process, mainly because migrants were not given a chance to argue that they could face harm if they were deported to this new country. Now, let's fast forward to this week. On Monday, March 16th, a federal appeals court stepped in, and in a 2-1 decision, the court agreed to pause the lower court's ruling while the government appeals the case. This is what's called a stay, and it basically means the earlier decision is put on hold temporarily. So, what does that actually do? It allows the Trump administration to resume enforcing this third country deportation policy while the case is still being litigated. In other words, even though a federal judge previously found the policy unlawful, it can still be used for now because the appeals court believes the government has made a strong enough case to keep it in place during the appeal. The administration argued that the lower court's ruling made it too difficult to carry out immigration enforcement, calling it an unworkable scheme that interferes with the government's ability to remove individuals from the country. Basically, they're looking for a faster and more flexible way to carry out removals. On the other side, attorneys representing migrants argue that allowing migrants to be deported to third countries puts them at serious risk. One of the key concerns is the speed of these removals. Under the policy, migrants may receive very little notice, in some cases just hours, before being sent to a country they may have never been to. Critics argue that without meaningful notice or the ability to raise objections, individuals could be deported to places where they face violence, persecution, or other unsafe conditions. There's also an important legal divide within the appeals court itself. The decision was 2-1, meaning one judge dissented and would have kept the block in place. That disagreement highlights just how contested this issue is. And this case is moving fast. The case started in a federal district court where a judge blocked the policy. The federal government then appealed that decision, which brought the case to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the next level up in the federal system. Importantly, the First Circuit has not ruled on the merits yet. They've only temporarily paused the lower court's decision while they consider the case. But even then, this likely is not the end of the road. The Supreme Court has intervened twice on an emergency basis, and both times, its decisions allow the Trump administration to continue enforcing the policy, and it could very well be asked to weigh in again. So for now, we're in a kind of legal limbo. The policy is active, but its legality is still very much in question. So why does this matter? Because this case is about more than just one immigration policy. It's about how much process the government must provide before removing someone from the country, especially to a place they've never been to. The appeals court's decision doesn't resolve that tension. It just shifts the current status. But in the meantime, there are very real consequences for migrants who could now be deported to third countries with limited notice and fewer opportunities to object. Next, we are going to continue our conversation about U.S. involvement in Iran, because while Congress chose not to limit the president's military authority in Episode 5, the situation on the ground has only continued to escalate. First, a quick reminder of where we left off. On March 4th, the U.S. Senate voted to block a resolution that would have required congressional authorization for continued military action against Iran, effectively allowing the president to move forward with military strikes. That decision kept the executive branch firmly in control of U.S. military involvement. But since that vote, there have been major developments. Iran now has a new supreme leader, Moshtaba Khamenei, following the death of his father, the past supreme leader, in the initial wave of U.S. and Israeli strikes. Early reports suggest that his leadership is going to take a harder line, mainly in regards to Iran's nuclear program. While the previous supreme leader acted as a brake on escalation, the new leadership is widely viewed as more aggressive and more willing to push the limits of Iran's nuclear capabilities. Efforts by intermediary countries to open the door to de-escalation or a ceasefire have been rejected, with Iran signaling that it is not prepared to pursue peace negotiations at this point. That matters because when leadership changes in a country where one person controls military and nuclear decisions, it's not exactly a routine transition. It's more like switching drivers in the middle of a high-speed car chase. So when that position shifts, and especially when it shifts towards a more aggressive stance, it can directly influence how the conflict unfolds. We're also seeing this play out beyond statements. Iran has continued to use the Strait of Hormuz as a point of leverage. This is one of the most important shipping routes for global oil, and any disruption there has ripple effects across the global economy. At the same time, the conflict itself is ongoing. The United States and Israel have continued targeting Iranian military infrastructure, while Iran has responded with missile and drone attacks across the region, including against U.S. assets and allied positions. So this is not a contained situation. It's an active and evolving conflict with the potential to expand. And this brings us back to the legal and constitutional question we raised in Episode 5. While Congress voted not to intervene at the moment, the longer this conflict continues, and especially as it expands, the more pressure there may be for lawmakers to revisit that decision. Under the War Powers Resolution, Congress still has the ability to act. But historically, once military operations are underway, it becomes much more difficult to pull back or impose limits. That creates a dynamic where the president's authority can expand in practice, even if the constitutional framework has not changed. So why does this matter? Because this is where law, politics, and real-world consequences all collide. This situation highlights not only the ongoing debate over who has the authority to take the United States into war, but also how quickly that balance can shift in practice once the conflict begins. Even though Congress holds the power to declare war, decisions like the one we saw in Episode 5 show how difficult it can be for lawmakers to step in once military action is already underway. And beyond the legal questions, there are broader global implications. Escalation in this region can impact energy markets, international alliances, and economic stability, meaning decisions made under U.S. war powers don't just stay within U.S. borders. They have worldwide effects. As this conflict continues, the pressure on both Congress and the executive branch will likely increase, forcing a deeper confrontation over the limits of presidential power and over the role of Congress in decisions of war and peace. Finally, let's cover a major development that ties directly back to what we discussed in our last episode. In Episode 6, we broke down the ongoing trial involving Meta and Google, where the plaintiff, KLGM, is arguing that social media companies should be held liable not for user content, but for how their platforms are designed. That separation is important because it potentially creates a new pathway around Section 230 protections. Now, in Episode 7, we're seeing that exact issue come up in a different place. not in a courtroom, but in Congress. On March 18th, the Senate Commerce Committee held a hearing marking roughly 30 years of Section 230, the law that has long protected online platforms from being held liable for content posted by their users. Republican Senator Ted Cruz, who chairs the committee, made clear that he does not support fully repealing Section 230. Instead, he's pushing for more targeted reforms, focusing on transparency and how platforms enforce the rules, and limiting what he describes as government pressure on tech companies to moderate certain speech. At the same time, Democrats like Senator Brian Schatz also criticized the law, arguing that it should not be treated as untouchable, and that Congress needs to respond to how much the internet has changed over the past 30 years. So for once, both parties agree that something needs to change. They just completely disagree on what that change should be. Some lawmakers are pushing for more aggressive action. A bipartisan bill introduced by Senators Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin would sunset Section 230 entirely after 2 years, effectively forcing Congress to either replace it or allow platforms to face significantly more lawsuits. On the other side, tech industry groups and free speech advocates argue that Section 230 is essential to the modern internet. They warned that without it, platforms may respond to increased legal risk by removing far more content, which could actually reduce online speech rather than protect it. Another important layer to this debate is what Section 230 was originally designed to do and how different the internet looks today. When Congress passed the law in 1996, the goal was to allow early internet platforms to grow without being crushed by lawsuits over user content. At that time, lawmakers were thinking about message boards and small websites, not billion-dollar companies with global influence over information and public discourse. That gap between the law's original purpose and today's reality is a big part of why this debate has resurfaced. And this is where the connection to the trial becomes really important. Because while Congress is debating whether to change the law, courts are simultaneously being asked to interpret its limits. The KLGM case, for example, doesn't focus on user content. It focuses on platform design. And that separation could become critical in determining how far Section 230 protections actually extend. So what we're seeing is something bigger than just one case or one hearing. We're seeing a connection between the judicial system and Congress, both grappling with the same question. How should the law treat powerful online platforms in 2026? And as these debates continue to unfold in both courtrooms and Congress, they could redefine the internet as we know it. So that brings us to the big picture. What ties all of these stories together is one theme. Who holds power, and how is that power checked? If you've been following along, you can start to see how these issues build on each other. In episode 5, we talked about a U.S. District Court ruling on immigrant deportations, and we also saw Congress step back, allowing the president to continue military action. In episode 6, we looked at how courts are being asked to rethink the limits of Section 230 in the context of social media design. And now, in this episode, we are seeing those same questions continue to play out. Across all of these cases, we are not just covering separate headlines, we are tracking an ongoing pattern. As these stories continue to evolve across future episodes, the key thing to watch is not just what happens next in each individual case. It's how this broader balance of power continues to shift in real time. Before we close out, I want to say thank you for listening to the 7th episode of Law on Law. If you found this episode helpful, or if it helped the law feel a little more understandable, that's exactly the goal of this podcast. In future episodes, we will continue breaking down major legal and political developments, and focusing on how those decisions actually affect everyday people, especially students. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to Law on Law so you don't miss future updates. You can also find episode summaries and more information at wallonlaw.com. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Law on Law.